I would just like to say that the thing I never thought I would walk away with tonight was a renewed appreciation of George W. Bush. So thank you for that. But I actually have a comment and a question, and my comment is that my mum considered herself a feminist. I'm not sure if I think that she succeeded in that, but I sort of gained a great understanding of feminism from her and felt the need to empower women. But I would never claim the title myself, not because it's something that I'm embarrassed or ashamed about or don't want the stigma, but because I don't feel like I ever worked hard enough or that my generation ever worked hard enough to be able to claim that, because I don't think that we knew how to fight. Because I think we were then given this thing where, I went to a single-sex school, all girls school, where we were always taught it was special because we were women, we were special because we were women. Whereas my family in New York, who I've just spent the last 2.5 years with, never got that. Both their parents worked, only my dad worked, and for most of my friends' families it was similar. And if their parents did work, their mum did work, they had nannies. There was no stay-at-home dad. But with my family in the US, some men stayed at home. Both parents worked in every single family, and the kids all went to co-ed schools where they just learnt to fight along with the boys. They weren't special, they weren't different. So when it then went on to go into the workforce, that sort of continued. Whereas I feel like that's kind of the difference between America and Australia, which is, I think my question is that it's, why do we have that? Well, there's so many single-sex schools here where women are empowered, but then when it goes into the real world, that's not the case as much as I think it might be in the US. And we have better healthcare and everything, but in the US, as far as my experience is, everybody assumes that there's going to be camps for kids in the holidays, and that's where they go. Whereas here, so both parents are free to work, whereas here, we have all the healthcare and mums can take some time off work, but then it comes to holidays and they've got to be around to look after their kids if they can't afford a full-time nanny. So I guess my question is, how do you guys feel? Sorry, this is so elaborate. I just don't know how to get it out. But how do you guys feel in terms of Australia versus American feminism? I guess my question is, I feel like we're really far behind, and I just wonder if you guys feel the same way, and if so, why? Or why not?
I'm sure you wouldn't say we're far behind. It's far more diplomatic than that.
What was interesting in our discussion...
More women in your national legislature than we do.
In our discussion before we came on, it was interesting where I thought also that Americans, and then we'd find that there were pockets where we were ahead in some ways and yet behind in others. It moves in different ways, and I mean, part of that also, I wonder, is we're dealing with a different beast in terms of the men that we're dealing with. Is that, also an issue? Culturally, we've got different... I want to
just make one point. You made a really interesting point, and I got what you were trying to say, which is that you felt you couldn't call yourself a feminist because you felt you hadn't struggled hard, gone on a hunger strike for the women's vote or whatever. And I get what you're trying to say, but I've had compared to a lot of women in Australia, I've had a pretty easy life, and I just call myself a feminist because I commit myself not necessarily to anything in my life being better, but to the lives of Australian women being better. So I think you can comfortably call yourself, you don't have to chain yourself to a horse to call yourself a feminist, that's what I'm trying to say.
And it may be that calling yourself a feminist will introduce you to a whole range of struggle that you haven't yet had to deal with.
Open the door. Right, would anyone like to comment? Fiona?
I think it is interesting, the point that you make about the difference between the US and Australia. And it's something I think I've kept asking you. But in the US, lots of women work. And in the US, because there are very different things around what men and women do, in particular in relation to childcare and bringing up children. So I think your point is correct. If you grew up in Australia or you grew up in the US, you would have a very, very different experience of parenting and parental involvement. And I think researchers in Australia have been struck by how little discourses around motherhood have changed in Australia, even though we've had changes in all these other areas. And I think it's really something we probably need to start thinking about, is the relationship between the way we understand what mothers are and what mothers should do and other forms of inequality.
And feminism.
My question is about women in positions of authority and power, and obviously the symbolic of value of that, which was, I think, Rebecca who made reference to that. Obviously there is a symbolic value, but what kind of cultural values should feminists, and I say feminists as opposed to just women, be pushing in for the kinds of institutional changes, systemic and institutional changes we need to address the question that I think Jane initially asked of the panel, because there's clearly a difference between simply having a woman leader, and I suppose Sarah Palin and Margaret Thatcher have been the rather unfortunate examples that have been used this evening. But what is it that we should be doing as feminists to change things systemically, workplaces and institutions?
That's a big question. Who would like to take a shot at that one?
One example I can think of in Australia at the moment is the Women for WIC network of feminists and other women joining together to campaign and lobby against the Northern Territory intervention into Aboriginal communities. And that seems a very grassroots campaign which involves sharing information, discussing issues, and lobbying and campaigning, but also intervening through submissions and policy processes around all of the legislation and policies around the Northern Territory intervention.
But it's Jenny Macklin that is leading that intervention.
Oh.
The law is being changed, the Racial Discrimination Act is being passed, and we're going to have that. So I'm talking about institutional and cultural values. How should those be changed? Jenny Macklin isn't making a difference. Women for WIC might.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, it's almost a question, do we have to not assume that every woman who gets into a position of power is a feminist? In that, would you have to treat every person as an individual and see if you can change that person, whether they are a woman or a man? Are we assuming that women who get into power are feminists and are interested in women's issues when they may well just be someone like Sarah Palin wanting to prove that she is one of the guys?
I suppose it's a really important question, but it's a very broad one, and I suppose I can't think of any rules that would cross every institutional context. So I think about the one institution I had some experience with for a decade, which was the Labor Party. What would bring about institutional change in the ALP? And I think that the thing that would bring about institutional change is knocking down as much as possible the factional power of a very small group of men who still continue to control who gets pre-selected and who doesn't. I used to joke to my ex-boss that there's no reason why they couldn't have all their important meetings in a men's urinal. And in fact, they traditionally did. And I suppose one important part of that is there are lots of extraordinarily capable women in the Labor Party. Some of them are doing well, some of them should be doing better, but it constantly surprises me the extent to which they acquiesce to some of the worst behaviour of men, and I think it just means that they need to, I think it's a whole new capacity to change. There's some institutional changes that could happen in the Labor Party, weakening the power of particular kinds of male-dominated unions that still get to choose who gets pre-selected. But I mean, I'm not being Pollyanna-ish about politics. I know it's still going to be a leadership group that are going to make decisions. But I think there are certain institutional things that you can change to make that group more transparent, make them more accountable, and make them, less narrow and less focused on power building, really, as the only raison d'etre of kind of politics. So that's what I would say within that context.
Fiona?
I think it's also helpful if feminists can identify and play a leadership role when they see new institutions in the making, to mobilise coalitions, to ensure that at the stage of institutional design we aren't seeing traditional masculinity built in with the bricks, but we're having a kind of a more inclusive institution in the making. So thinking about the UK and devolution, for example, the creation of the Scottish Parliament, there was a very kind of self-conscious mobilisation of feminists and the wider women's movement, all sorts of different sorts of groups, to, if you like, ensure that there would be the representation of women in terms of higher numbers of women MSPs, but also a sense of a greater substantive representation in terms of trying to build structures in which there would be a more inclusive idea of politics, sort of newer ideas of politics, and in which it would be more likely that a kind of broader political agenda, including those issues that are traditionally thought of as women's issues, would be more likely to take centre stage, would be more likely to result in outcomes. And in a very kind of simple way, some of the things that happened in Scotland, and Scotland is not a country that culturally would immediately come to the top of your list of yes, women-friendly. We're better known for Braveheart, aren't we? And, Sean Connery. But there were things like a real attempt to make the political parties rethink the job of a politician, so that it was no longer seen as a kind of reward for being in the right faction, or a reward for being,
Secretary of a trade union.
Yes, or 25 years as a party member. So all those sorts of things happened. There were quotas introduced, certainly in the Labour Party, and I think that quotas do play a role in institutional change. There's a creche in the Scottish Parliament for... Oh, sorry, is that how you say it in your country? So there's a kind of visitors' creche in the Scottish Parliament, which is, if you like, both a practical and a symbolic recognition that actually citizens have caring responsibilities. And there are things like an equal opportunities, women's policy machinery, which I know you have anyway. But a kind of real sense in which we might try and do politics a little bit differently. And I'm not kind of going 100% down the road, it's all touchy and feely and things. But just, can we change things on the margin a little bit? Can we do things in a different way? And the first Parliament returned 37.2% women. Yeah. It went down after two, actually. went up to nearly 40% and then went down again. And I think that also shows that, just vigilance. That there are a lot of legacies, even in new institutions. There are, a lot of path dependencies.
So I had to think a little bit about that question. So culturally, I think, in the United States at least, we actually have come quite a long way. And to recur for a moment to Sarah Palin, she stood up in front of people as a working woman and an elected governor of a state, a woman with 4 children. Am I doing 5 children? I'm not doing the count right. With 5 children, and making no apologies about working or having children. And that was no longer seen as an anomaly. And I do think that the tension between women who don't work outside the home for pay and women who do work outside the home for pay, which was sort of the 1970s and 80s dichotomy, has passed. And so part of continuing to insist on a citizenship that recognizes women as complete citizens, which still in the U.S. means a shift in how we think about citizenship and a shift in, I'll just leave it at that. So I think that continuing insistence that we're more than half the nation, and that means that we need to be taken with respect and we need to be everywhere. And then there is a sense, I think, also in the States now that if there's an institution that's only men, even the men are looking around and thinking, there's something not right here. We need to have some women here, if only for show. We really need to do that. And then in terms of institutional change, I think that's the big issue for the states. Our party system and our electoral system really work against change in terms of just personnel. The incumbency rate in the House is over 90%. It's usually over 95%, which means that people are walking straight back into the House of Representatives. And there are years in which 10% of sitting members of the House have no opponents. It's just unspeakable in a democracy. And in the Senate, it's over 80%. How we change that, I'm not sure. But I think we have to be ready, in part, for a car crash of the party system. And I think that's where we see the so-called Tea Party movement pushing against the party system, increasing percentage, it's not perhaps as dramatic as it's been made out, but increasing percentage of people who are no longer identified with a political party, many of whom are young people. It occurs to me in the next 10 years we might see a major change in the political party system, and when that happens, if it happens, there's an opportunity for feminism to make a big difference. Perhaps it won't make a big difference, but that's the kind of opportunity, it seems to me, that we need to look for before we even think about changing institutions, in the hopes that that party change will raise new issues and involve new actors, many of whom will be women, most of whom, my guess is, will still be feminists.
At the risk of sounding repetitive, I'm studying vet science, which is a highly feminized degree. In my year, there are 75% women to 25% men, and it's a meritocracy to get in as of up until this year, so it's completely UAI based. Yet, upon graduation, the male practitioners are likely to be paid $10,000 to $20,000 more than the female practitioners, and I don't really understand. Do you think that that's as a result of women not recognizing their self-worth, or it's just a complete result of the institution, or because women leave to have children? Or I just don't understand how that can happen with, there's 10 years these statistics have been collected, and we're still being paid significantly less than our male counterparts with the same experience.
And this is a conversation that you would have with other girls who are
Yes,
studying.
we're all very pissed off.
I'm just wondering what the reasons, what reasons you guys are coming up with. Is there, or is it? I mean, apart from being pissed off, obviously, but.
Well, we thought, because people think in large animal practice, men are stronger, and also men in the country are less likely to respond to a female practitioner. And also, everybody just seems to think it's because we go and, at 30 we go and pop out a baby and then work part-time for the rest of our careers.
If that's true, you should be paid a lot early on. If you're going to leave at 30, you should get a lot of money when you're young. That would be just. It's wage discrimination. So I do think that poses a real, this obviously poses a real problem. So first of all, I don't know about Australia, that's illegal in the United States. And so there must be some systemic way to address that collectively through a professional female vets association. Secondly, when wages are offered, and again, I don't know what it's like in Australia, it's usually privatized and individuated. So you're face-to-face with an employer who makes an offer to you. There's no one there who can consult, and you have to trust that the person making the offer is providing you with full information. Often, I hear this all the time, including recently from my own son, whom I set straight quickly. The idea that, women aren't very good negotiators, and it's now my belief that what women are told in negotiation is substantially different from what men are told. And so there's an individual strategy that one has to develop as well, and you have to be brave enough and feel secure enough in that individuated situation to make a strong claim. I remember in probably the only successful wage-upping experience of my whole life, it was over the telephone, and I had promised my husband a dollar amount I would ask for, and I just held the phone shaking. I wasn't face-to-face, and I said the amount, and they said, okay. So there are the two things, and I see that as a real problem, but that kind of offer that's $10,000 or $20,000 less a year, let's just call that unjust salary discrimination against women. That's wrong.
Thank you so much for everybody for being here tonight, and please thank our wonderful panel who have been so great tonight.